It is October 22nd, 2025, and the Trump administration is not hiding the fact that it is openly pushing for regime change in Venezuela. Of course, this is not the first time that Trump has gone this route, but he is taking a bit of a different approach in his second term, as he is now openly talking about the possibility of land strikes. He's openly saying that he has approved CIA operations inside the country targeting the government of Nicolas Maduro. So, what does that mean for Venezuela and for the region as a whole? If the Trump administration gets its way this time around, well, we got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Fiorella Isabel, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and co host at Truthwire. Fiorella, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here because Trump really is not hiding the fact that he is pushing for regime change in Venezuela. He's building up the U.S. military in the Caribbean, carrying out a number of attacks there, openly saying he's considering land strikes, and that he has approved covert CIA operations inside the country. So, how do you view Trump's approach this time around, and what does it tell us when everything is so out in the open that even this claim of drug trafficking is obviously just a cover up for the regime change that they really want?
Right. Well, you just said it, right? It's a cover up for the regime change against Venezuela. And this has been a long time coming. And we need to understand that the biggest threat right now to Venezuela isn't coming from Donald Trump, but it is coming from Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is, of course, the one that has been pushing for war against Venezuela for now, I would say, decades since he's been in politics. He's a go-to Gusano. He's the go-to guy that has always cultivated this pro-imperialist sentiment, especially in Florida. When we talk about Miami, when we talk about the Miami Cubans, the Miami Venezuelans, he has cultivated the opposition forces there. And before he was actually part of the Trump administration, he had been pushing throughout his career to get at Venezuela via funding NGOs. And this was all revealed through the data leaks, actually, ironically, that we've been having. Even Elon Musk's own NGO attempts to get rid of the NGOs highlighted a lot of this. That this is nothing new for the Trump administration. The other part of this is that Donald Trump was always going to pivot towards the Middle East and Latin America during his second term because of the fact that he's trying to promote himself as the peace president. So it's not coincidental that we're seeing the timing of all of this happening right now. For example, he is being promoted as the ceasefire peace president, while of course we see Israel violating the ceasefire, and simultaneously he is being pushed as the one that's going to bring peace in Ukraine, when we very well know whatever may be achieved is only temporary and conditional. And of course, we've heard this time and time again that there will be some sort of reconciliation. And again, this is always going to be on US terms. And so while we're seeing that mechanism of Trump being poised as the guy that's going to bring an end to the wars, we see him pivoting to the Middle East towards the expansion of Greater Israel and, of course, to Latin America, where he, of course, wants the oil, he wants the resources, the gold, very, very important minerals for the coming tech, fourth industrial revolution of sorts. We're talking about the minerals that are going to help with AI, with computer development. And so Donald Trump is really looking at a transactional, I would say, operation more than any sort of just boots on the ground. I think what we're seeing in media is a portrayal of military boots on the ground, but really whatever he does, as you mentioned earlier, the CIA is involved, is going to be an attempt to covertly have this regime change through, I think, trying to turn members of the Venezuelan military, trying to turn people and scare them into submission. And this has failed many times in Venezuela, but the US is definitely putting all their forces out for this time.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you bring up Marco Rubio because I know that, there's been a lot of talk about him and kind of his central role. And we knew that this was going to happen, right? We knew as soon as Trump chose or maybe selected Marco Rubio as his Secretary of State that there was going to be a focus on Latin America. And it's interesting because I think about when we went through this with Syria in 2014, 2015, and if you brought up the CIA, you were called a conspiracy theorist, right? You were demonetized and censored on social media. The idea that the CIA would get involved and, try to overthrow the Syrian government while at the same time coincidentally fighting ISIS, that wasn't allowed to exist. But here we kind of have it all laid out of this is exactly how the Trump administration plans on doing it. Given that it's out in the open, what are your concerns about just how far the US could go here?
Yeah, well, the thing is, that's it, right? We're being told openly that the US has a CIA involved, that they are getting all their intel and their information directly from the CIA, that this is now being openly written throughout mainstream media, including The Guardian. And the fact that we're being told this signals to me that whatever happens is going to be done actually in a more way that is not just covert, but is justified through some sort of what we would call a false flag attack, some sort of excuse to give them the red light, right? We're seeing the narco trafficking, the drug trafficker excuse being thrown out there with no evidence. And the fact, of course, that Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, pointed out is that the majority of the drugs and the majority of the capital from the war on drugs, as we know, has gone to the United States for the United States, and even recognized by international law, by the UN. Venezuela has very little to do when it comes to the war on drugs, when it comes to narcotics. So obviously, that's an excuse that's not even sticking. But what I think we're going to see in terms of this time around, especially with Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, I think what we're going to see is an overt type of justification for doing this. And the thing is, I think we're at a point in the US where we have become aware of a lot of this where we weren't at before. So I think that the reason why it seems so open to us too is because people have found out through what's happened in Gaza, through what's happened with Russia and Ukraine and Russiagate and all of these things that have happened, especially in the last 5 years, that the United States has been doing this for a long time. And so it's getting more difficult for them to actually come out of this as something credible, to actually give the excuses of, oh, yes, we're going in, we're going to save the American people, we're going to save, you know, the American public from these drug cartels. But the reality is that unfortunately, there's a sector of the population that still supports Donald Trump that is justifying this just based on the fact that we need to clear our borders, we need to go after the people. There's justifying surveillance, and so they're surely going to justify targeting innocent fishermen, which is some of the latest people from Ecuador as well that the Trump administration has killed, violating international law. So we're going to see that, I think, happen. But what, again, I think is more so along the lines of our footprint, so you will, the modus operandi of what we do, is going to be a story thrown out there of something going on, but more so done covertly. We've also seen, by no coincidence, Maria, what's her name? I'm blanking on
Maria
her name.
Corina Machado, yeah.
Maria Corina Machado, who wasn't even the candidate last time around, if you recall, but she is the one that has been, of course, thrown into the Nobel Peace Prize nomination, and she won. And then, this whole thing being paraded around her is the fact that this is now the pivot. Like, okay, look, she's the one that's going to bring democracy to Venezuela. Let's put that out again. And I think it's really sad and pathetic because they've tried this time and time again and it hasn't happened. However, I think because there's so many distractions going on in the world right now, this is why they did it now, right? This is why they're trying to get away with it right now.
Yeah, and you see the timing of it, right? Trump acting like he solved everything in Gaza, right? Don't worry about the genocide that's still ongoing. He brought a ceasefire there. Everything's good and figured out there. Don't worry about the famine. But then over here, as you're noting, you've got Maria Corina Machado coming back into the spotlight. And I thought it was interesting. I know some clips have been circulating on social media of an interview that she did with Donald Trump Jr. back in February. And that's when she was openly saying, hey, we're going to privatize the oil industry, right? American companies are going to come in and make a lot of money, come and take our resources. She was telling the Trump administration exactly what they wanted to hear. How do you view the position that she's in now versus, say, Juan Guaido back in 2019, where the Trump administration at the time was like, yeah, that's the new Venezuelan president, and it didn't work out too well for him?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the pivot, I think the strategy shift is like they're not denying the goals. And this is kind of also part of the Trump administration's like flat out like, hey, we're going to say the quiet part out loud. We're going to tell the truth and we're going to get away with it because this is who we are. We're going to embrace being the police of the world. We're going to embrace being the bullies and thinking Latin America is our backyard. We're going to embrace the Monroe Doctrine and we're going to go after the Venezuelans at a time when we're promoting peace. Look at us. We're look, Maria Corina Machado is essentially going to bring democracy, and it's going to help the American economy. Because if you look at the focus of the US right now, it's the economy. It's the fact that things are so expensive, that there's inflation, that there's so many things happening in the US economy wise that maybe this will actually ring some sort of truth for many people in the United States. Not that they really care about Venezuela, but hey, maybe this will benefit the economy and it will benefit us Americans. That's what he's selling, and that's what I think a lot of people are buying when it comes to that. And I think because of the fact that Maria Corina Machado has been a figure behind the scenes so much in the last election attempt that she tried to steal, that still media to this day say that Nicolas Maduro lost the election. I think that the fact that there's so much importance surrounded to her towards her is kind of signaling that there are more resources being poured in than before, that they've learned from their mistakes, and that they're trying to, in a way, I think, use this sort of blackmail on Venezuela. There were rumors that, for example, Nicolas Maduro gave everything up. If you remember that Donald Trump said, oh, he tried to give us everything because he's so scared that we're going to come in. Well, according to my sources, those rumors that Venezuela was going to stop trading with Russia and China are false. That Maduro didn't actually say that. And again, Donald Trump says one thing and we don't really know what's true or what's not. And this is of course not just uh, you know uh, relegated to him, but to other presidents as well. But in particular, when it comes to Donald Trump, he tends to speak in very big, boastful type of language. And what I think is happening here is also an attempt to figure out, how Venezuela is with Russia, how Venezuela is with China, what are their alliances with Iran, because there is also that alliance with Iran. And Russia and China will support Venezuela when it comes to strategic partnerships, when it comes to even defense in terms of manufacturing, in terms of things like that. But if there were to come a point where there was an actual war waged on Venezuela, the way Russia and China operate is very pragmatic. They don't get involved. They sort of say we need to follow the UN Charter. And that's kind of what Lavrov recently said. He said, we condemn the interference on Venezuela's sovereignty and we hope that peace can be resolved through the UN Charter. So I think there's also that testing of seeing, how Venezuela is doing. Do they have the military capacity, they say, because Venezuela is arming, right? They're doing the Plan Independencia. They're gathering all sorts of militias. They're training, they're preparing for an actual confrontation. And that's what we're seeing here from Venezuela, that they're going to fight. They're not just going to give up. But the United States, more than ever, seems almost just completely boastful of what they're doing. They seem sure, right? And it is kind of scary when they are this sure, because when they are this sure, I suspect that they have something up their sleeve.
Yeah, it's incredibly concerning. And even just the build up to it, right? The fact that you have Trump here talking about, like, oh, yeah, we may bomb a sovereign nation, like, as if he's going to wake up tomorrow and decide whether or not based on how he feels about it. And as you were noting there, when it comes to the position that the Venezuelan people are in, I mean, they have been through it with all of these sanctions that the US has imposed targeting their country. And obviously, countries like Russia and China and Iran have found ways to continue to work with Venezuela despite all of the threats from the US. And so I am curious too, when it comes to the position that the Venezuelan people are in, how do you see them and how do you see really the spirit to continue to fight back, especially if the US does attack the country directly?
Well, ultimately, I think Venezuela is one of the few countries that functions ideologically. And what I mean by this is they have the Bolivarian Revolution. They believe in the Bolivarian Revolution, and that stems from Hugo Chavez and what he did for the people. When I was in Venezuela, there were houses that were constructed for people. This is very similar to the Soviet Union, which had apartment buildings constructed for the people, and people remember that because till this day they still have that to rely on. They still have this idea of, okay, whatever happens, we have some sort of backing of the government. Now, of course, that's not denying what the sanctions have caused. That's not denying the economic turmoil that people have had to endure. But the fact that people even stayed in Venezuela and endured hunger and endured just complete and total poverty, to make it a point that no matter what, this is our country and we are a sovereign people and we are going to fight for our sovereignty, is, I think, one of the more important points that I think can be reflected throughout many of the countries that have faced US imperialism or Western imperialism. And that is something that can't be necessarily taught. We see that also, for example, in the resistance factions in Lebanon by Hezbollah, and Yemen's Ansarallah. We see that, okay, the chance may be very small. You may face a lot of adversity, but you're going to prove your point. And that's stemming from an ideological nature, not a pragmatic one. A pragmatic nature would say, all right, well, let's just open up our markets to the United States and try to do the best we can and figure out a way to coexist. So they understand, though, that ultimately you can't coexist with that because the United States wants to control Venezuela's flow of goods and resources, just like they pretty much control that of Peru and pretty much control that now of Argentina. We've seen what's happened with Malay, of course, and they're gearing to do that towards Bolivia with the latest election. So again, this is Southcom, right? In Latin America, this is the ultimate plan. And so Venezuela has been looked upon as a beacon of not just the ideological socialism, but more so the resistance, the anti-imperialism in Latin America. And I think Colombia has taken note because if you remember before Gustavo Petro, the relationship between Colombia and Venezuela was not good because it was a US backed establishment president. And now with Gustavo Petro, who recently gave a very scathing interview to Univision, which is a neoliberal outlet, and basically said the United States, they're using this as an excuse. This is all about Venezuela's oil. He basically told it like it was, and this is very rare for a Colombian president to say. This signals that there's an awareness in Latin America of what's happening, and there's also a fear of what happens if Venezuela falls, because with Venezuela, you also have the ties to Cuba, which is, again, a very, very poor country facing sanctions and decades of intervention and imperialism. And then you have Nicaragua, and then you have very little left. Honduras and Mexico, I would say, are more progressive, and that's it. And so it's ultimately the capture of the entire Latin American continent. I would say the country, the continent of South America, and then of course Central Americans as well, that are fighting for this sort of identity, this sovereignty. And I think that's why we're seeing the attack on the Caribbean, which includes Venezuela, which includes Colombia. It's including, of course, these areas. And that's something that I think, in order to understand that, you need to go back to the history of Venezuela and why they're fighting, how they're fighting in spite of the odds.
Yeah, incredibly important points to keep in mind here as we're watching this. And yeah, it is interesting to see how each country has a different approach to this. The last thing I want to bring up, because you're talking about the US targeting of Latin America, it sounds a lot like the US targeting of the Middle East, right? This fight for control, this fight for influence, this idea that if any of the governments in the region don't act exactly as we want them, aren't filled with our puppets, then we are going to target them. How do you see the Trump administration? And I mean, it feels like it's at this point of getting to the point of overextending itself, right? It's got the proxy war against Russia. It's still enabling Israel to commit genocide. It wants more war against Iran. You've got Venezuela, you've got Colombia. It's like, it feels like there has to come a point where it finally becomes too much. So, how do you see the position that the US is currently in?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that there is a point of overextension. And this is why I think we're going to see eventually Trump try to finagle something in Ukraine, because remember, he ran on that and he hasn't delivered. Definitely didn't deliver on the 24 hours. And he's still trying to push the idea that he's delivered a ceasefire in Gaza and is bringing peace. So I think the next attempt is going to be Ukraine. And again, notice that Marco Rubio is the one that's meeting with Lavrov, right? And we also have the same type of mentality. Why is it then with Russia that they have a different course of action? Well, because they see Russia as a formidable foe. And I think that's what they're trying to get out of Venezuela, is to see how far they will go, to see how well prepared they are. They did it with Russia. I don't think the United States nor NATO expected Russia to be as formidable as it has been and as prepared as it has been to take on. And with that preparedness, that power, I think what we're going to see is an attempt to normalize with Russia. And there are, I don't know if you've noticed, but there are several sectors in Russia that have been promoting this idea of US and Russian like unity of sorts, which is kind of crazy, because any sort of unity with the United States, it's not going to favor in the long run, not with the current government structure that exists. But there's this idea that that's a potential possibility. So I think PR wise, we're going to see Trump and the conservatives sort of push that. And what after Syria is my process is, no country, as strong as it might seem, is beyond the ability to fall, right? Like I mean, Damascus fell so quickly and so rapidly after years and years of fighting and succeeding. And I think with Venezuela, I know that they have been looking at what happened in Syria and have been looking at themselves and trying to see, okay, what's going to happen if, for example, we're left out in the dust and there's not enough aid coming to us. We're going to take matters into our own hands. And that's why we're seeing the, comprehensive defensive strategy. We're seeing them really prepare their entire population, whether it's police, firefighters, military officials. And I think the United States right now is going to have to pick its battles as to where it's going to go. And I'm pretty sure they've already picked their battles. They're going to try to end the war in Ukraine, and they're going to continue expanding Greater Israel and focusing on Latin America, because Latin America has the key resources that they need going into this next phase. And it's all about, of course, competing with China. And right now, what we're seeing is this kind of global capital rat race to get the most resources in order to stand and be able to compete. And I think that's where this idea of the multipolar world is, in a way, kind of full of hopium, because just because we have multiple powers doesn't mean that there's automatically equity. Equity will have to be earned. But, we'll have a powerful Russia, we'll have a powerful China, we'll have a powerful US, and well, Europe has gone down the drain. And I think we're also seeing that with the US too, is that they've noticed that Europe has been entirely just sucked dry of its wealth and its power. So, Europe doesn't really seem like the best ally at the moment. And I think that's what they're thinking. I think they're going to just put everything on NATO, put everything when it comes to the war in Ukraine on NATO, and wash their hands off of it, and continue focusing on the Middle East and Latin America, which is where I think we're going to see more and more pushes, especially even towards Colombia, because again, Gustavo Petro has proven to be much more of a nuisance than they were expecting initially.
Yeah, it's very telling when you see it. Like, we're talking about it being all out in the open, but we're also watching as US foreign policy is continuing business as usual. And I'm with you. I think it's something that the multipolar world as a whole, they are going to have to figure out, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this when there's an ongoing genocide, or when one of our allies is being openly targeted and the US knows exactly what it can get away with? Certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Fiorella Isabel, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and co host at Truthwire. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.